Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So welcome to this conversation on who is perpetuating the war in Sudan, profit, politics, and patriarchy. The United Nations has said that this is a topic where the world has been scandalously silent. So thanks to all of you who have made time to join us today and talk about this very important issue. My name is Rita Morbia, and I'm a co-manager here at Interpares, and I have the privilege of being your moderator. Interpares, which means Among Equals, is a Canadian feminist social justice organization that believes in solidarity as an approach to international cooperation. We work with activist groups in many different parts of the world, including Sudan, as well as here in Canada. The event is being co-sponsored by the Gender, Peace and Security Collaboratory at the University of Ottawa, an interdisciplinary network to foster partnerships amongst researchers, practitioners, policymakers, community activists, and Indigenous partners. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which Interpares is based stands on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe people. In acknowledging the land, we also want to reaffirm our institutional commitment to act in solidarity with Indigenous people in three key ways. First, by nurturing programmatic links with Indigenous movements and activism, particularly feminist Indigenous organizing. Second, by supporting Indigenous resistance and resurgence. And thirdly, by encouraging our organization supporters and other non-Indigenous people to support and invest in movements for Indigenous rights and decolonization. In highlighting these commitments, I'm reminding myself and encouraging other settler people with us here to take a moment to reflect on how these commitments might inform our engagement in today's event. That there is no peace without justice, abroad or at home. The webinar will be held in English, but we do have simultaneous interpretation into French. So click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen to access this feature. Le webinaire se déroulera en anglais, mais nous disposons d'une interprétation simultanée en français. Cliquez sur l'icône de la map monde en bas de votre écran pour accéder à cette fonctionnalité. And a reminder to the panelists to speak a little bit slowly so that the interpreters can keep pace. Our technical support day is Monique Couillaré. Please send her a message in the chat if you are experiencing any technical issues. She will also be monitoring the chat to ensure comments remain respectful. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you're joining from. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Interpares website, and it will be sent to everyone who registered. There's been an overflow of interest, so we are also streaming it on Facebook Live. I'm now going to introduce the speakers for today. We're very appreciative that they have made time to share their thoughts and analysis. Reem Abbas is a political commentator with expertise in women's rights and civic spaces, and a feminist activist. She is a former member in the coordination committee of the Sudanese Women in Civic and Political Groups, known as MANSAM. She is currently a 2023-2024 non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. Reem, like millions of others, had to flee her home in Khartoum to escape the ravages of the war. She is relatively safe now and joins us from Cairo. Welcome, Reem. Magdi El-Gizouli is a Sudanese academic and a fellow of the Rift Valley Institute. He writes on Sudanese affairs on his blog, stillsudan.blogspot.com, and in other publications, often with an emphasis on political economy. He was recently interviewed by the website Phenomenal World, and that interview was turned into an article entitled Marketing War. Magdi joins us from Germany. Thank you for joining us, Magdi.
Thanks.
Rebecca Tiessen is a professor in the School of International Development and Global Studies and director of the Gender, Peace, and Security Collaboratory at the University of Ottawa. Her current research examines feminist foreign aid policies and the role of civil society actors in promoting gender, peace, and security. Rebecca will be making some concluding remarks and leaving us with some key issues. Each of us today here are speaking from our own perspectives and not necessarily representing any sort of consensus viewpoint. And you can ask panelists questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And the last half hour or so, we'll look at those questions, and hopefully there will be ample time to ask our panelists to answer them. Now, in order to situate the panelists' comments, I'm going to outline a few facts for those who may be new to the political situation in Sudan. Sudan was ruled by the 30-year dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir beginning in 1989, and that era was characterized by conflict, impoverishment, and oppression. 2005 marked a significant moment as a comprehensive peace agreement, or the CPA, was signed, ending decades of war. In 2011, as agreed in the CPA, the southern part of the country held a referendum and voted overwhelmingly to secede, to separate and form their own nation, South Sudan, which they did the following year. Oil, one of the country's most significant exports, was now located in South Sudan, and pipelines required for export traveled through Sudan in the north. In any case, Sudan virtually overnight could not rely on oil extraction as a source of hard currency. Fact was that much of the country's wealth went straight into the hands of powerful individuals, including al-Bashir and those in his orbit. The dictatorship was brutal. That al-Bashir was wanted by the International Criminal Court, the ICC, for crimes in Darfur was an indication of that brutality. Used a series of militias to perpetrate these crimes, and they morphed into the paramilitary force now known as the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF. During al-Bashir's reign, demonstrations were often swiftly and violently felled. However, at the end of 2018 and into 2019, saw larger and larger pro-democracy protests in Sudan. And what started as demonstrations against the end of subsidies became a nationwide call for freedom, a revolution that overthrew the dictatorship and heralded in a transitional period of joint military-civilian rule. It was these demonstrations that captured the imagination of the world, especially the bravery of the many women and youth who took to the streets. The protests led to a political agreement, which aspired to be a roadmap to a more democratic and participatory governance model. And it established a power-sharing agreement between the military and civilian representative organizations. This 2019 political agreement indicated that the transitional period was supposed to last 3 years. Another feature was that the transitional power-sharing structure had what was called a sovereign council, a decision-making body at the highest level, part civilian, part military. On the military side, I want to point out two particular representatives, General al-Burhan, who came from the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF, he was the chairman, and Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who everyone calls Hamedi. Hamedi was the head of the paramilitary RSF from Darfur in Western Sudan that I mentioned earlier, and Hamedi was the deputy chairman. The transition didn't last long. It was cut short by General al-Burhan in October 2021, halfway through the transitional period in a military coup. There were attempts after the coup to come to some kind of stable political arrangement through what was called a framework agreement. I know, however, that many of the Sudanese I've spoken to after October 2021 basically felt that they had no responsible government. So now to describe the current conflict, I will turn to the panelists, and we're going to begin with you, Magdi. So over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to talk to you. And a word of appreciation to those who tuned in to listen, and the co-panelists, of course. I'll try to talk you into some of the details of the horrendous war that is gripping Sudan. Some of you might have seen images on newsreels or in newspapers. And like many other conflicts in the world, it is taking on a chronic feature. It is now 6 months and a half into the war that erupted on 15th April. The humanitarian fallout is by all means of epic proportions. The main facts might be known to some of you. 6.3 million people have fled their homes. Half of those are children. 5.1 million people have been displaced inside Sudan, which makes Sudan on the top of the list in terms of numbers of internally displaced people. 1.2 million people have crossed to neighboring countries as refugees. Over 10,000 people have been killed in combat or in combat-related events. 90% of those crossing the borders are women and girls. Most of the households crossing the borders are female-headed. Almost half of the population is food insecure. That's 20 million people. Of these, 6.3 are at emergency levels of hunger. That's 6.3 million people. Almost 5 million children and pregnant women or nursing women suffer from malnutrition. Almost 85% of households in the country spend more than 65% of their income on food, while a third of the population cannot afford what the WFP understands as the basic minimum. 19 million children are waiting to go back to school and have lost their chance to an education. There are two major zones of warfare. Greater Khartoum, that is the capital city of Sudan, located at the meeting of the two Niles. That's an urban landscape of 9 million people and 21,000 square kilometers. That's the vast space of urban buildings and structures where fighting is now almost door to door. And the second major zone of warfare is in Greater Darfur, the main locus being southern Darfur around Niala. That's Sudan's second largest urban conglomeration, a city of 1 million people, half of whom are probably IDPs of earlier wars, of the long war in Darfur. The total population of Darfur, who are now sort of suffering the big brunt of this conflict, beside the population of Khartoum, is estimated at 11 million people. Now, is there an explanation at all for all this mayhem? Is there a possibility to escape it? I'll try to answer the first question. The second is beyond me. Many explanations have been paraded in the media. Many explanations go around in the commentaries, some of which have been taken up by the UN. The least helpful to my mind is the reduction of such a complex war that involves so many people to the avaricious or evil nature of two men. And unfortunately, for many reasons, this is the most popular explanation, or one that reduces this complex history and this complex conflict into the poor manners of Al-Burhan and Hemeti. This might address a proximate factor in the timing of the war, but says little beyond that. A second explanation sees the war as a sort of reckoning of the disenfranchised periphery of Sudan with fat, obnoxious Khartoum, the capital city. An explanation overlaid with the notion of an ethnic confrontation between peoples in the riverine heartland of Sudan and pastoral peoples of Darfur. This explanation feeds out some elements of Sudan's history, thematizes some drivers of the war, but refuses to deal with its immediate reality, which is the conflict between these two major fighting forces and the actual protagonists fighting it, and relies on a moral argument to explain what is now, by the fact of happening, a historical necessity. Things, once they happen, are historically necessary. And surely, as you all know, history does not follow a moral compass. Otherwise, the continent where you all live wouldn't be what it is now. It might help to untangle the many factors that led to this situation into proximate factors, intermediate factors, and structural factors. This sounds very academic, but it isn't. It might be helpful because there's so much material to work through. Now, the proximate terms of the war were set out in the diametrically opposed proposals over the reform of the military and the security sector, tabled by the two protagonists, the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces, as part of the workshop format talks that Rita talked about, this so-called framework agreement. The framework was shepherded by the US, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the UK, the UN, the African Union, and the IGAD, which is a regional organization in East Africa. The first four organized the so-called Quad, and the last three as the trilateral mechanism. As you can recognize, these are all diplomatic terms for the same thing, essentially, with a sort of mediation. These many hands helped usher in the storm, to my mind. The RSF proposed the integration of its forces into the SAF, into the army, the formal army, over a period of 10 years, beginning with the top command. So they wanted to retain their forces and to insert their commanders into the command of the army. The SAF made a diametrically opposed proposal. They proposed a 2 years process, beginning with the integration of troops, which means we begin from below and rise up. The two sides interpreted these proposals as an RSF never to integration, coupled with a scheme to undermine and eventually take over the SAF command, and a SAF plan to absorb the RSF's troops right now and pluck out its leadership. Once these positions solidified, war became hard to dodge. The details of who shot at whom on which day, on which hour, might be of chronological interest, but have little relevance beyond that. The intermediate underlying factors driving the war have something to do with the militia form, a militarized wage system, or if you like, the commodification of violence as a way of managing the dual rural and urban crisis in Sudan. For all practical purposes, the accentuation of this crisis dates back to the independence of South Sudan, when Sudan lost most of the oil coming from the south. And with that loss, lost most of its foreign currency returns and entered a period of economic deterioration and decline. This read out of this loss was a livelihood crisis that was ameliorated in the city, but hyper-intense extraction in the countryside. So the city got poorer because it lost its main source of income, which was oil coming from southern Sudan. And as a result, the response was hyper-extraction from the countryside, lower wages for agricultural labor, increased extraction from agricultural production, and increased commodification of livestock. A process, this hyper-intense extraction, was channeled partially through these commodities that I've named, but also through a new commodity, gold, that was found in some of Sudan's distant corners. And managing that gold economy required the commodification of violence, because these were distant areas with little government presence, with little control. The movement of that gold required a lot of smuggling activity, and snatching out some of the income of that gold required controlling these smuggling activities or buying into them. And one way to centralize this entire process was the expansion of the rural militia, the RSF. Gold and the militia complemented each other. The rural militia itself has many iterations, including the slave army that toppled the Darfur Sultanate of old in 1870. The British, Sudan's colonizers, also recruited militias in places like the Nuba Mountains and relied on them to get ahead of militant resistance. In a way, the Sudanese army itself, initially the Sudanese battalions in the Egyptian army, began as a sort of militia. The history of the Sudanese army is in many ways the history of rebellions against its authority, from within its ranks and from without its ranks. There were militias raised in the 1980s after the big famine of the Sahel as part of the war against insurgents in southern Sudan, the Sudan People's Liberation Army, which became a ravaging force in border zones between northern and southern Sudan. The most successful version of the rural militia is the Rapid Support Forces that Rita introduced, because the interests of that particular militia coincided with regional interests that didn't exist in the 1980s or even before. Besides fighting an internal war in the desert zones and clay plains of Darfur, this particularly successful militia had the opportunity to fight a petrodollar-funded war in Yemen. Some elements of that happened in the Libyan-Chadian War in 1980, but not with that level of armament or experience in fighting. The RSF had been fighting in Yemen for a few years before the government of al-Bashir was toppled. This created an opportunity where there were independent relations between the RSF leadership and their employers in the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. Relationships that were independent of the formal channels of the Sudanese armed forces or the state, as it were. In many ways, it became an expatriate private security firm that young people looked to as a way of improving their livelihoods. Their war in Yemen was a doorway to these aspirations. Sudan had suffered the big post-oil slump after the secession of South Sudan. There was a big deficit in the balance of payments and foreign exchange. There was a massive inflationary wave, and people needed to supplant their wages. And one way of doing that was to become a mercenary in a company that sells violence, the RSF. In that vein, UAE-based companies based in the United Arab Emirates, also started independent of the RSF to recruit fighters in Khartoum through employment agencies. People thought they were being recruited to work in supermarkets in fancy Dubai, but ended up in training camps in Libya. This caused a public outrage, a democratic outrage, the type of stuff that a country like the United Arab Emirates cannot tolerate. People marched in the capital and attacked the embassy of the United Arab Emirates with loud slogans that the people inside definitely could hear. This was during the brief period of blossoming of popular agency after Bashir was toppled, the period that Rita called the transitional period. In one way, the crisis of the RSF began when the war in Yemen cooled down. Thousands of people came back, thousands of fighters from Sudan, from Yemen to Sudan. They needed income, they needed employment, and some level of insurance. They were all young. They had years of fighting careers ahead of them if they had become professional soldiers. The RSF had to manage the cash economy in terms of its investments, and it needed to find a purpose for these fighters. Any other company would start to shed off workers, as you all know. But that's very hard when your workers are soldiers. It's hard to shed them off. There were two ways ahead for the RSF. Either it would dismantle itself in some way, which wouldn't align with the interests of its leader, who wanted to become the top man in the country, or the interests of his patrons in the United Arab Emirates. Or it would expand, but there was nowhere to expand into. He was already the second man in the state. The only way forward was to capture the entire state. The RSF commanded the significant portions of Sudan's newfound gold, a new commodity that the old trading system was not capable of absorbing because it was geographically spread in a way that taxing it properly and managing the labor force around it was very difficult or was very costly and required a militia to do so, a mobile armed force like the RSF. These gold mines were spread all across the country, and the RSF served as a privatized army to secure the transit routes and the smuggling routes of that gold. And it's very important to note that the United Arab Emirates is effectively the sole recipient of Sudanese gold abroad. It has almost a monopoly over the imports of Sudan's gold. After Sudan's readiness to sign the Abraham Accords with Israel in 2020, the United States started lifting sanctions against Sudan, which before had crippled Sudan's ability to deal with the monetary system. But the UAE's monopoly and facilitation of gold exports from Sudan preceded all these developments. Signing or not signing, sanctions on or off, Sudan's money went through Dubai anyway. The RSF discovered other networks beside gold. If you have a well-functioning smuggling network, you could use that to do other things. You could smuggle other items. And one important item that the RSF began smuggling was drugs, narcotics. Just as it did with gold, it began moving narcotics across the country, and it became a big salesman for narcotics. And in a way, drugs and the sale of narcotics was a way to penetrate Sudan's urban malaise, urban crisis. It was a way to build roots in Sudan's neighborhoods in a city like Khartoum. Outside Khartoum, the RSF worked its way through the countryside through investment in debts, a market in debts, people selling by index is what I mean. became a heavy involvement of the RSF in these sorts of Ponzi schemes in places, distant places that are capital poor, where the main capital provider was the big man with the gun from the RSF. Places like Niala or Al-Fashir or later in Khartoum became sites for the emergence and collapse of Ponzi schemes. The RSF, in a way, was a lending agency that could help people exit debt traps and place them into debt traps. And in many ways, to my mind, that is how it managed to create the type of network it created in rural Sudan, which allowed it, for instance, now to lay hold on Darfur. The commodities that allowed the RSF to penetrate into the urban and the rural worlds were, in my mind, gold, debts, narcotics, arms, and contraband cars. And these are cars that anyone of you who had been in Khartoum, like Rita and probably Reem, would know, cars that were smuggled into the country from places like Libya and Chad, sometimes with the blood of the last owner on the seat. And these cars were a way to import capital into the country. And very importantly, the RSF is a big employer, and that's something you need to think about very well if you want to provide solutions. You could find a job with the RSF, not only as a soldier, but also as a technician, as somebody who drives the car, as somebody who does media, as somebody who writes well-meaning political statements. And it was a way to find an employment away from the state, from its requirements with degrees and paperwork. It's a place where you could get employed through a wasta, through a mediation. And it was not the crushing, highly exploitative agricultural labor system of Sudan. Now, these are, to my mind, the immediate reasons and the proximate reasons for the war. And the intermediate reasons for the war. I'd like to say something about a structural relationship that makes Sudan a place for wars, not only this war, a place for wars that Rita talked about in her introduction. And that, to my mind, is the way capitalism works in a periphery, in a place like Sudan, and how people like the young boys, the young men who are fighting the war of the RSF today in Khartoum and in Darfur and other places are shocked out of subsistence into the commodity market. These are the forces that undermine the challenging relationship between farmers and herders in Darfur and made their relationship one of war. And also in the wider Sahel region, because this phenomena is not only related to Darfur. This confrontation crystallized into a racial confrontation between herding Arabs and farming Africans, something that you might read about in books about anthropology of Sudan and anthropology of Darfur. However, to my mind, there's another element to this. The issue is rather the declining returns of export-oriented crops versus the increasing returns of livestock exports, the financialization of livestock and herding, and the increasing returns of the export of these animals to places like Dubai or Jeddah and the many other cities of the Arab Gulf. In a way, the war in Sudan is driven by the needs of the barons of commercial livestock herding, gold mining, and private militias to dismantle the existing state restrictions on their profits. These restrictions come from taxation, licensing, customs, or the rest of the gatekeeping functions of the state. And why do you want to do this? Because they want to maintain their competitive edge in the Arab Gulf market for meat, for gold. And it's also a market for men who can carry guns and fight. And so this is, to my mind, the structural reason for the war. And here I'll end my discussion.
Thank you for that, Magdi. I mean, you've spoken about how the RSF is not just a militia, but traced the ways in which it is also an economic, a corporate entity. You know, argued that this economic motive is essential to understanding the current war. One of the issues you mentioned earlier was the Abraham Accords with Israel in 2020, and it leads us to the issue of the transition. So perhaps you could briefly talk to us about, you know, from your perspective, how that transition, which so many brave people in Sudan struggled for, was undermined. What was the economic contribution that Sudan asked for to ensure a successful transition? And how was that request managed by the international community, particularly the US and the international financial lending institutions?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you. I think that's probably at the heart of why what is now called the transition failed. I think this language is not very helpful because it tracks um, changes through these terms that don't really tell you much. But what does a transition mean? What is that supposed to inspire or mean? And to my mind, it's not a word that's very helpful, but that's beyond the point. I think the problem is that Sudan could have been bailed out of its crisis. The crisis in Sudan cost 60 billion US dollars. It costs Sudan's debts on the amount of money it has been taking out of the international monetary system since the 70s. And Sudan was campaigning for debt relief. That debt relief was made conditional on political requirements. The political requirement that the US placed on the table was signing the Abraham Accords with Israel and becoming part of a wider regional security system that involves the UAE and Saudi Arabia just opted out with the war in Gaza, of course, but it involves the major autocrats of the region. And on the top of that debt relief, Sudan required a 10 billion US dollars to start off and a sort of a new economic journey, to replace the type of exploitative system in Sudan's countryside with some sort of production, to find replacements for the pastoral economy that was becoming a commercialized ranching, militarized commercialized ranching in Sudan's peripheries. Many people in Sudan had an awareness of these requirements, the economic conditionalities that would make the transition succeed or not succeed, but nobody was willing to bail off Sudan. People were very happy to take pictures in the protest on the protest grounds and to talk nicely about the Sudan's revolutionaries, or to tweet pictures of these brave young women in various versions, and maybe to pay a bit of money to do some propaganda work, to shoot a film or to make a video or to do some type of propaganda work that Western observers like to see themselves in the faces of other people from other countries. But nobody was willing to go beyond that requirement and to address Sudan's actual needs, which was feeding a hungry population and rebooting the economy in the countryside, and investing in agricultural technology. These were the terms of Sudan's recovery. These were the terms that would have enabled, possibly, Sudan to move out of the trajectory it found itself in since the independence of South Sudan. And the Western donors were not ready to do that. And the only thing they were ready to do was to scheme around these framework agreements and recovery agreements and transitional agreements. They were doing a lot of politics, but they were doing very little economy.
Thank you for that, Magdi. It's not a perspective that we often hear. It's often lost in the narrative that people portray when talking about Sudan and the war in Sudan. I'm going to pivot and bring Reem into the conversation. Reem, I want to give you a chance to reflect on what Magdi has said. But first, I know you have some slides that you want to share with folks just to give a visual of what is happening in Sudan. And there's one quite graphic slide, but you'll warn us before you go to that slide in case anyone wants to turn away or close their eyes for a moment. Just for reference, it's slide number 9. So please do go ahead, Reem, and Monique, let's start the slideshow.
Yes, I'm going to go through this very quickly because I just wanted people to visualize the damage. So first slide was taken 4 days after the war began, and it just kind of shows the landscape of Khartoum city. So yeah, we can go to the other slide. This is a research center called the Muhammad Omar Bashir Center for Sudanese Studies at Durman Ahliya University. And as you can see, this is a very important research center. So many important records and books were burned actually in the center. This is just a house I found, but so much destruction of civilian property, so many houses, including our own house. We still don't have pictures, but we're also told that it's full of bullet holes. So a lot of destruction to civilian property. This is Durman market. Most of the major markets in all the conflict-affected states in Darfur, as well as Khartoum state, have been burned. This is just a picture showing, this is a very familiar scene, just people taking the little things that they can take and fleeing. Sometimes you can't even take a bag because, sometimes you're kicked out of your house by the militia, or you have to leave quite quickly. So you just basically leave with what you're wearing. But this is a very, very familiar scene. So this is outside Khartoum. So those people were displaced from Khartoum. They went to another state, River Nile state, and they were staying at a dorm, or a lot of people are staying in schools, dorms, and public buildings, and they were kicked out actually from this public building. So it shows that once you become displaced, you could become displaced twice and 3 times and so on. Because I'm also going to talk about this, women are peacemakers, but they're also part of the war machine. This is Comrade Halima, who is a leader in an armed group, and you can see her standing next to some of the leaders in armed groups as well. This is something I found very interesting. This is just like the kind of images you get from Google Maps and different satellite imagery websites, and it just shows that Khartoum is an empty city, a city emptied of its population. You cannot rule a place when the people are no longer there.
The next slide is a difficult one.
The next slide is a difficult one. So you can choose to look away. I'll let you know once it's no longer there. This slide is from Adjinena. As you can see, their bodies, and it's not only the fact that they're corpses on the ground, but it's also that they're used as a barricade, basically, to avoid the cars and vehicles from coming into the neighborhood. So even after they're dead, they continue to be degraded, and I just found it very disturbing. So yeah, I think so now I can talk a little bit, and I want to comment on what Dr. Magdi was saying, his brilliant analysis of how this war happened. So I just want to reiterate a few points, and also just say and just offer a perspective on others. So I agree with you, Dr. Magdi. This war was inevitable. We all saw it coming. It doesn't mean that we were not surprised, because you're never really ready for war, but we did see it coming. Due to the last, I would say, thing that led to this war is the failure of the framework agreement to get signed or to pass through the leadership of the Sudan armed forces. So in this sense, you are saying that it doesn't matter who fired the first bullet, and I think it does matter who fired the first bullet, because if we assume that the Sudan armed forces began the war to get rid of the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, then we're already assuming that there is almost a division within the country's army, because the RSF, although it was, it is a paramilitary group, it was operating under SAF. So if this is the scenario, then we would be having a very different discussion about sovereignty and issues related to how the army, which is a critical pillar of the state, and this pillar is now greatly compromised, and there is a huge threat to the existence of the state, or that there's no state in the first place, and that the army right now is not really the army. And this is really this is problematic because it will, in a way, could contribute to delegitimizing the fight against the RSF, which I believe is a threat to the existence of the state itself. And it would, and at the same time also, we don't want to support the perspective of giving the RSF part of Sudan's territory, because their claim right now is that the army is now hijacked, and the army is hijacked by Islamist leaders and forces, and that they are the army of the people, the army that represents the interests of the people. So I think we have to continue to reiterate that this is a coup. What happened on the 15th of April is a coup. And it was a coup orchestrated by the RSF, who took over actually one of the important army bases a day before, on the 14th of April. So this was organized, orchestrated, everything was underway. And I agree with Dr. Majdi that they have been building different networks in different neighborhoods, narcotic networks and different neighborhoods that they use to smuggle different things over the years, so they could operationalize them during this pivotal moment. So I will reiterate that what you said, the financial networks of the RSF started to reap less benefits, and making this war a necessary objective for them. And also, if we focus on how the framework agreement failed, let us talk about what this agreement could have led to, and which is really a very important question. It is important to explain what the results of the agreement would have been, to understand why the RSF, as well as the forces of freedom and change, the FFC, the main political coalition in Sudan, became invested in the framework agreement. And also to understand how the framework agreement doesn't come back. It cannot come back as a legitimate option, because some people feel that the only way to move forward is to go back and sign this agreement, or to go back to the 14th of April. So in specific, this is a war against a paramilitary force that rebelled and orchestrated a coup against the state, and it threatens the existence of the state. The RSF, as I mentioned before, had to try to take over the state because its financial networks were failing, and because they knew that also the army as an institution wouldn't have signed that framework agreement. They were pressuring Burhan, the leader of the army, not to sign the framework agreement. And the framework agreement was fundamentally flawed, and here I am very critical of the role of the international community, because this framework agreement, which is very much flawed, was led by the international community, and who know, based on so many experiences in different countries, that any country with two armies, this is a recipe for war and a recipe for disaster. So what were people expecting? In fact, how would an agreement that gives ample time to the RSF to integrate into the national army help in limiting its expansion? The framework agreement was good for the RSF and the political elites, but it was not good for Sudan. The war that began in April 2023 could have started in 2019, and it could have started a few years from now, depending, of course, on internal and regional dynamics that Majdi elaborated on. This is sad, but it is true. My other comment is, and this is, I think it's very critical, because this war is often described as a war just between two generals. And as much as it is true, but there's so many deeper historical issues, so there are historical underlines. So, for example, there is a discourse within the RSF that this war is a continuation of the 1898 Battle of Karari. In fact, one of the advisors of the RSF, said that the RSF is an extension of the army of the Ta'aishi, who was a leader who ruled Sudan between 1885 to 1898. So the RSF also benefited from the literature and thinking of a political elite, in Western Sudan, that believes that they were robbed from ruling Sudan because there is an elite, in central and northern Sudan that conspired with the colonial forces, that conspired with the British against them. And this is why this discourse views the political elites of the, riverine tribes or central and northern Sudan as colonial agents. And during this war, we even have a discourse that refers to some groups as a colonial force, So we have to really dig deep into this discourse. So in the sense, the RSF, part of the RSF and its discourse, they feel that they are regaining control of a Sudan that they lost over 100 years ago, due to British occupation. And it's interesting, but this discourse and the violations that are happening right now are causing a social rift, the same social rift and complete breaking down of the social fabric that happened after the rule of At-Ta'aishi 120 years ago. And I'm not entirely sure how this, damage to the social fabric could be, repaired basically in the long term. But like I said, so many dynamics, so many things led to this war. It cannot be just seen as a war between two generals. Because if you don't properly understand how this war came to be, we cannot resolve it. Thank you.
Thanks, Reem, for showing those pictures and for also bringing in some of the historical elements at play. Given Magdi's analysis of the economic and political forces, as well as your reflection, let's pivot a bit and talk about the role of women. We know that they were pivotal in the revolution that led to the transitional period. For the most part, they are not military leaders or soldiers. They certainly didn't have central positions as political leaders or decision makers during the transition. So as a feminist activist, how do you see their involvement or lack thereof in terms of the forces perpetuating the conflict?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sudan's current governance structure is unable to absorb women, because Sudan has, what, Alex Dewal, a theorist calls a political marketplace. And in fact, it's a militarized political marketplace. So political marketplace, it's a governance structure or a system of governance where you have monetized patronage. So you people exchange, political loyalty for payment, basically. So you have to have something to provide to enter into this political marketplace, whether it's allegiances, whether it's some kind of armed groups and so on. So in this marketplace, the political marketplace in Sudan is controlled by men with arms. And if we go back to what Hemeti, the leader of the RSF, said in 2014, he said, if you don't have a gun, you don't have a voice. Okay. If you don't fight, you don't have an opinion. If you don't fight, you don't have an opinion. Okay. So this is why the marketplace in Sudan is completely, monopolized by men with guns. And of course, the political parties, traditional, leadership and so on, they enter and exit this market based on the allegiances they offer. Because of course, this is the marketplace is a very dynamic system. So because this is a militarized marketplace and because, women are, largely unarmed, it's difficult for them to penetrate this marketplace. So in a way, it is in the interest of women to challenge it, and to break down the structure, because if you don't have a non-violent civil politics at play and at the center of governance structures in Sudan, then women are going to continue being out of the equation. So women have to fight for governance structures and recenter them around politics and civil politics, actually, to make sure that they continue to participate. Otherwise, they will not do that. So we have to dismantle the current structure that gives ministries and different positions to men simply because they have guns. And I also want to say something. Women are not always peacemakers, in this conflict and in other conflicts. So in this conflict, we have, different ways in which women are also fighters, are combatants, and also part of the war machine. So you have, for example, hakamat, who are like traditional poets, and I've seen so many videos of those poets with RSF, basically coming up with poetry to encourage them to continue fighting. And they would say things like proverbs, and they would come up with lines that are very interesting, and they kind of want to maintain this, or they want to kind of add fire to militarized masculinities, and make sure that the men keep fighting. So, for example, sometimes they would say proverbs like, if you have a Kalashnikov, you eat for free. So if you fight and you have a Kalashnikov, then you don't have a problem in life. So it's definitely important to interrogate the role also as part of this war machine, and interrogate how this war machine will continue to make sure that they're not part of any decision-making positions.
Thanks for that reminder that it's important not to essentialize women and the role of women. However, the war has been vicious to women in particular. According to the UN, the 1.2 million who have fled to neighboring countries, the majority are women and children. Over 70% of the hospitals have collapsed, leaving women who need maternal care extremely vulnerable. According to the WHO, over 4 million women and girls are at risk of sexual violence. And there have been, just horrific accounts of the violence women and girls have already experienced and continue to experience. Reports indicate an ethnic dimension to many of these crimes, particularly in Darfur, counts of forcible marriage, slavery, kidnapping for ransom. And we're asking here who is perpetuating the war, but perhaps the flip side is, who are the peacemakers? Who's trying to stop the war and how? And many activists speak about the women, peace, and security agenda. So this is a really broad term describing everything from women's role in political processes, including peace negotiations, to addressing sexual violence as a weapon of war. In some countries at the UN have adopted a series of corresponding resolutions. Some countries have national action plans. What does women, peace, and security agenda mean to you in this moment for this particular conflict? Is it relevant?
Yes, absolutely. And yes, it is definitely, this war has been largely a war on women, sadly. And part of it is, is also like the fighting culture of the culture of fighting when it comes to like the RSF fighters. Many of the things, again, because I listen a lot to the different poems and the different popular culture that is being spread out there. So in many cases, I can see that they believe that once they attack, and if they're winning, or they have to take over everything. And by taking over things, as bounty, the bounty could be a person. So when the women are taken, they are considered as part of the commodities and bounties that are being confiscated because they are winning. So this is definitely, interesting to consider the social norms and cultural values. I want to reflect on what Cynthia Enloe said before I tell you what I think or how I think the WPS agenda is important. So Cynthia Enloe, a feminist theorist, she said that women's political participation cannot be effective if they don't have, gender consciousness and some feminist understanding, and not be so constrained that she cannot act on that consciousness. So in the sense that, like I said, we have to center the practice of politics around civil politics for women to advance women's political participation. But at the same time, we have to reflect on the women's movement in Sudan. And I think this is a key. So we have to do the legwork, before we expect things to work. So if we want to have an effective WPS agenda at the local level, we need to look within the women's movement in Sudan, a movement that is fractured, a movement that has a lot of power dynamics, a movement that has biases, a movement that is sometimes elitist, a movement that is very much where you have so many of its members or so many of the the feminist and women's groups, they want to continue to be the wings of the patriarchy. They want to continue to be the wings of the political parties. So in a way, we have to untie the women's movement from political parties. At the global level, we cannot disconnect national and international security issues from military spending and arms. So we cannot secure and we cannot have peace unless we talk about, issues such as arms trade, such as military spending, and so on. And at the same time, at the local level, we cannot have an effective women's peace and security agenda if the women's movement itself is not looking at this as a priority, because right now the women's movement is also completely held hostage, in many times by the patriarchal political parties. So, and this is why sometimes they have been very absent and silent when it comes to women's rights and violations against women and so on. And they're very active when it comes to issues that are very much connected to the political parties they represent. We need a holistic, decentralized women's movement that is able to push forward, our agenda in all spheres, that is able to represent our values, basically, and that is able to represent our issues at all levels. And this women's movement needs to be able to also be representative of the diversity of women in Sudan, from different backgrounds and areas and so on. And finally, like I said, we cannot separate international peace from women's peace and security, because we cannot continue to reproduce insecurity for women and then expect the WPS agenda to work. And here I want to refer to, Canada, because Canada, has a feminist foreign policy. So countries like Canada that have a feminist foreign policy have to reconsider, how they feel about, arms expenditure, military support, and so on, because we are affected by this. If there is a feminist foreign policy, then we need to see how this is going to affect us as countries and as women in the global South. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, Canada often talks about its feminist foreign policy. However, what we know is that Canada has a feminist international assistance policy. It has a national action plan on women, peace, and security. It has some of the elements that might be part of a more holistic feminist foreign policy. But what's been promised by the government is a specific document outlining what we have as a feminist foreign policy. What it's, we're asking for one that really emphasizes that we have a feminist foreign policy, that indicates what it comprises of and how it's implemented. And without these specific elements, the government of Canada remains able to sort of pick and choose when its foreign policy is feminist at its convenience, without a broad and comprehensive and overarching commitment, which is clearly articulated and enforced, and to which it is accountable. I'm going to bring Magdi back. Please join us, Magdi, and we'll turn to some of the Q&A. So if folks in the audience have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We're going to start with the regional landscape. I mean, regional governments have a fair bit of influence on this war, and you've talked about that a little bit, Magdi. You've certainly referred to it. I mean, some have taken clear sides, but they've also played both sides, Wondering, Magdi, if you can give us a sense of who is backing whom in terms of some of the states in the region, and perhaps start with the UAE, which you've already mentioned, which is ironically currently hosting the UN Climate Conference in Dubai.
Oh, thank you for your question. I mean, as you probably know, the UAE has one of the biggest sovereign funds in the world. It's a very rich country with a very small population, and as a small indigenous population, that is. It has a very large foreign workforce on its cities. The population of the UAE in the past few years has been increasing at great leaps. And to maintain that level of labor force satisfied without causing an internal insurgency, you need to pay them well. Because in terms of numbers, if all the foreigners in the UAE decided to get rid of the ruling families, they could do that in a second. It's a bit like the situation in India under colonial occupation when the British were ruling India. In terms of numbers, if the Indians would all stamp with their feet at one point in time, they might have been able to get rid of the British. And this is a similar situation in the big Gulf cities, if you've been there. And one way of the social contract is built on high wages for foreign workers and a free lunch for the nationals. And to keep that going, you need to plunder. You need to make sure that you can accumulate a lot of money from foreign, distant places where the damage and the death does not reach your own shores. And that's the logic behind the United Arab Emirates' involvement in Sudan. And its primary interest in Sudan involves Sudan's shores, and they were in negotiations over a port on the Red Sea, on the Sudanese side of the Red Sea, with a total cost of $6 billion US. You need to know that Sudan's gross domestic product, Sudan's entire import earnings in 1 year is around $8 billion US. So alone, just the cost of this singular sort of construction, which would have been a free trade zone that any Hayyikian economist would admire, something like Jebel Ali, which is the big port in the United Arab Emirates that is essentially the fulcrum of trade, slowly becoming the fulcrum of trade between Asia and Africa. And the UAE reaps the benefits of that exchange through this critical node on its shores. And something similar was supposed to be designed on the Red Sea. And the UAE wanted to make a lot of money out of it. Negotiations with the government of Sudan were difficult. There was an agreement of some sort, but this did not translate into implementation. And before a conclusive answer was reached, this war broke out. And that's one major geostrategic or long-term interest of the UAE. Another more structural interest is something more mundane. It's cheap meat. If you want to keep a lot of workers in a place like Dubai happy, you need to feed them well. And the one single item that is protein-rich and that could make you long work hours is meat. To grow meat at cheap prices, you need cheap pasture, and you need essentially a people-free country, except herders. And something similar was was expected to happen in Sudan. The biggest enemy of a herding economy is probably the city, because the city is superfluous. If you want an economy based on herding and the export of sheep, you probably don't need the cities anymore. You don't need the education. You don't need the healthcare. You don't need the culture. You don't need the type of libraries that Reem likes. They become secondary items. And I think in the general scheme of things, that was one major interest of the UAE. And of course, the third thing is that Sudan would have been the third element in a militia-based system that the UAE is engineering in Northeast Africa. It involves people working in militias in Chad. It involves militias in Libya. And it might also visit the type of people who are making deals with the UAE at the moment, like the presidents of Uganda, the president of Kenya. All these incidences of bad luck that had befallen Sudan might also befall them when the UAE calculates differently. And if you're a country with such deep pockets, you can, in a way, you can afford to buy off a few officials here and a few officials there. And I think that's the logic and that's the way the UAE has been dealing with Sudan. It's not a very thankful thing to do. Sudanese expatriates have been at the forefront of construction of the UAE since it took off properly in the 1970s. Sudanese engineers, Sudanese doctors, Sudanese teachers, Sudanese housewives have been at the forefront of making the country what it is today. In many ways, it's also a bit of Sudanese territory in there, a lot of Sudanese labor in there, a lot of Sudanese imagination and administration in the UAE. And I think it goes back to the way a country based on a ruling family functions. Ruling family that is a bit scared of the demographic changes around it. Very scared, of course, of the big neighbors, Saudi Arabia and Iran, and it's also putting itself in very difficult situations between big countries like China and the United States, and disputes around artificial intelligence, and disputes around the export of technology, and disputes about the funneling of money, of Russian money, for the benefit of the war effort in the Ukraine, the Russian war effort, that is. And they want to play all sides against all other sides and remain the winners. And I think the long haul for the UAE is not going to be an easy one. At some point, you need to pay the price of all these adventures. They might not pay the price of the Sudanese adventure, but they will probably pay the price of bigger adventures they're setting their eyes on. And that's, I think, if there is one country you would need to point a finger to, then it's the UAE. The Egyptians are involved because the Egyptians, of course, consider Sudan a backwater, which in many ways it is to Egypt. Their main interests in Sudan are around the security of the Nile waters. And this has been, in many ways, the logic behind the entire state from the very beginning. It is constructed around the Nile waters. So the 1956 Sudan, to paraphrase the philosophers of the RSF, was built around the security of the Nile waters. And this is what is bringing Egypt into the game. Of course, the Sudanese from the riverain heartland of the country, from riverain Sudan, consider Egypt home in many ways. And as you can see, a lot of people who could afford it from the heartland of the country moved immediately north. This is a place that they know, a place that speaks a similar language, eats comparably similar food, has a culture that is quite reasonably close. And that's where they feel at home. And there you can feel the pushes and pulleys, the centrifugal forces that are pulling Sudan apart, with parts of it sort of moving closer to Egypt, other parts understanding themselves as part of the Sahel, of the west-east axis, and other parts with proximities to southern Sudan. So there is a fragmenting element in there. And I don't fear the fragmentation to come from just the big men with guns. I think the bigger problem is when the civic identity of the country breaks down. And this is something that Somalis know very well. If you talk to Somalis, to Somali people who've been going through a war for the past 30 years, the one thing that they mourn very much is the loss of that civic identity, the loss of the feeling of belonging that keeps people together, that makes people from different parts of the country communicate and understand each other and understand each other's concerns. And I think this is what's breaking down. People are looking at each other as foreigners. Well, they're shooting each other on the streets, of course, so they might as well look at each other as foreigners. And this is creating a great estrangement, and parts of the country are moving apart. This might be a realization of one motivation of the regional powers that are involved in Sudan, like the UAE, is to break the country apart. It's much more easier. It would be much more easier to control many Sudans instead of whatever remained of the unitary state after the separation of South Sudan. It would be much more easier to buy off elites or rulers or important men and women who enter what Reem calls decision-making positions. Now, these men and women in decision-making positions are, to my mind right now, the biggest threat to the country.
Thank you for that. Reem, there have been many attempts at ceasefire negotiations. There has been little progress. It would be, I think it's important to understand why, and if you have some perspective on this, who are the players involved in. There have been multiple attempts with multiple players at ceasefire. What are the barriers?
Yes, I mean, I think Dr. Magdi already answered part of this question, because right now it is a fight over land and territory, for regional actors and also for internally, So as the RSF, and SAF feel that this war is only going to be won through military means, the ceasefire is not going to be, their ideal choice. So right now, what's happening is you just have SAF and RSF moving on to control different territories. Or I would say, because SAF, controlled Sudan, but now the RSF controls different territory in Sudan. And what we're seeing right now, and I think many people are trying to say that, Sudan is headed to a Libya-like scenario where you have one state, but, two states basically, or two governments, I'm not going to call them governments because governments gives a sense of legitimacy, but I'll call them two authorities, two authorities in one state. I think we're already there because what's happening right now is you have the RSF controlling almost all of Darfur and parts of Kordofan. There's still a conflict in Khartoum, so no one controls it. It's kind of on its own terms. But what's happening right now is you have a complete administrative secession. An administrative secession in the sense that the central government is not paying the salaries in the RSF-controlled areas. It is not providing the services, and it's not the body that has control over the lives of civilians over there, whether it's their protection, healthcare, education, and so on. So in a way, people in the RSF-controlled areas have to wait for organizations or for the RSF to provide them with the basic needs. So this is already an administrative disconnect, dissociation, secession, whatever we call it. And this is all making ceasefire very difficult because as long as the two sides feel that they can get more territory and they can do this, then it's just very, very much, it's very difficult. But I think when it comes to the vision of like the feminist vision of how this process could happen, of course, ceasefire is the basic thing that people ask for, but we need a peace and political process. And I feel that we don't need one peace and political process because right now there are in Sudan, it is a larger war, but there are different kinds of conflicts that are happening. So you have the major conflict between the RSF and SAF, but you also have tribal-based conflicts, for example, in parts of Darfur and Kordofan. So those also need to be dealt with separately and as part of the larger problem. If we want to address the root causes of violence, we need to ensure that the negotiations this time are not centered around quotas, especially for women. So, and the entire process needs to revolve around the lived experiences of women, as they are bearing the brunt of this conflict. So, and of course, the women's movement, like I said, needs to play a major role here, and it needs to look at the holistic picture, and it should be able to articulate a strong position against militarism and against gendered power structures within the movement and at the political and societal level. I want to give two examples just to kind of give a glimmer of hope of how women activists are mobilizing and the great work that they're doing on the ground on this front. Just a few days ago, a body calling itself Women Advancing Security in Sudan, and it's a body that has women from different parts of Sudan, they met with representatives from the armed forces and the RSF, and through Zoom. And by the end of the call, they agreed that there is a need to establish a unit to oversee the ceasefire, and that this unit would be led by women, and that women should be included in the talks. So I think this is a good initiative. At least women are taking the lead on their own, not as part of the political forces that are trying to manipulate and this process to their benefit, and to use it as just an opportunity to go back to power. Another good glimmer of hope is a few months ago, a feminist vision for peace was reflected in what is called the Feminist Statement Against War in Sudan, which is a very good statement. So the writers thought to establish a position that is deeply rooted in the age-old feminist struggle for peace and freedom in Sudan. And the statement effectively, said that the war never just starts when the first bullet is shot, but it has foundations and structures that creates a social, political, and economic base that instigates violence. And it looked at all the issues that make up this like war economy, whether it's military expenditure, the IMF, the militarization of the state, and the marginalization, and so on. So it provided a vision or a way forward, basically, and in this vision, it highlighted that, for example, we cannot understand rape just as a weapon of war, because rape in this sense and in this context cannot be untied from social norms, for example, that turns women's bodies into commodities for exploitation. So they brought forward a very important analysis, and I think a good, solid feminist vision on what this war is doing and how it started and how we can move forward. So those are all like glimmers of hope that I wanted to mention to show that women are mobilizing and they're doing a lot of work.
Reem, that's amazing. So just before I turn it over to Rebecca for some concluding remarks, there's a question on Canada, and I just want to briefly answer that myself. I mean, in terms of Canada's position on Sudan, I mean, there are UN Security Council sanctions. There's an arms embargo and an asset freeze and a travel ban on designated individuals. It could be stronger, absolutely. In terms of humanitarian assistance, Canada has pledged, I think it was 165 million in humanitarian assistance. However, the gap is massive. The need is 2.6 billion. And only about a third of that has been fulfilled. UN agencies are talking about cutting rations in the refugee camps. In terms of diplomacy, certainly Canada needs a stronger diplomatic response backed by human resources and expertise. Representation at the highest levels. Currently, there is no ambassador to Sudan or ambassadorial equivalent. And it's worth mentioning that our trade relationship with the UAE amounts to about just over $2 billion. So there's a lot that could be stronger, bolder, more robust, certainly in Canada's response. And with that, I am going to say, and stop here with our panelists, but I want to take a moment to acknowledge that this is not just some distant objective topic for you, Reem, or you, Magdi, that it is deeply personal, that you have friends, families, you yourselves have been affected. So I really appreciate your analysis and your presence and taking the time to be here. Thank you so, so much. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you. There's so much rich information to synthesize. The numbers that Magdi shared with us in his initial remarks are staggering, and these facts provide overwhelming evidence of the urgent need for peace. And Reem's images drive home this urgency even more. And yet there's so much silence, as Rita mentioned in her opening remarks. Another silence that we touched on today, something that's also grossly underreported, is conflict-related sexual violence, the widespread use of gender-based violence. And we need to pay attention to these reports, not just gender-based violence, but also sexual exploitation and slavery and trafficking and forced marriage and more atrocities that are targeting women and girls in particular, and as linked to social norms, as Reem pointed out. Reem and Magdi, you gave us important information to guide our understanding of the complexity of the conflict beyond the simplistic messages we get in mainstream media, particularly in sharing the challenges arising from power struggles as linked to profit, politics, and patriarchy. I think we have a clearer picture of the overwhelming challenges of unemployment, militarized masculinities, resource monopolies, drug trade, poor management of revenues, inequality in livelihoods, and others. These insights are vital for our learning and also for our strategies for pressing for the changes and support needed in order to end the conflict. What we learned today helps fill the silence, and I hope will inform policymakers, scholars, activists, students, civil society allies. We must continue to press for policies that guide international commitments that prioritize peace and justice. We in Canada must continue to seek out information, press our government representatives and policymakers to demonstrate our existing commitments to international agreements on women, peace, and security, our stated principles, not the least of which is in Canada the promise of a feminist international assistance in written form and a supposed unofficial feminist foreign policy, though highly selective, as Rita pointed out. These commitments require us to address the diverse gender-specific needs in Sudan, including support services for conflict-related sexual violence, access to gender-sensitive reparations, but also putting feminist priorities of peace and justice at the center of everything we do, in trade, in what we sell, and in our work with civil society organizations in Sudan, including women's movements and their mobilizations. So let's all continue to raise our voices and continue to seek out opportunities like this, keep finding activist spaces as we call for peace in Sudan. Most importantly, and as I think we've really understood today, we need to keep our attention on the underlying causes of injustices that perpetuate violence and inequality, and our shared global responsibility to do so. And also the opportunities for new visions for feminist peace, as Reem pointed out. So with that, I want to thank Reem and Magdi. We've had benefited so much from your immense knowledge today. You've given us so much information to think about. I'm grateful for all of the insights that you've shared with us and the passion with which you've shared it. Thanks also to Monique Cuillère for the tech support and Kath Clark for the comms support. Thank you to our interpreters. Our appreciation to our respective institutions, of course, Inter Pares and the Collaboratory on Gender, Peace and Security at the University of Ottawa, and especially to Rita Morbia, who convened this event, bringing together this outstanding panel and guiding this excellent conversation today. Thanks to everyone who joined today. I'm so grateful that so many students that I know joined this webinar. Thank you for joining, everyone. The recording will be shared with all of you, and thank you so much for attending today.
Thanks, everyone. Much appreciated.